There's an image I can't get out of my head when I think about Russian space travel. There's a space shuttle standing in the hangar of the Baikonur Cosmodrome in Kazakhstan. It looks suspiciously similar to the space shuttle, but it's the Soviet version of it. Of course, we're talking about the Buran, which translates as snowstorm. It flew exactly once in November 1988, fully automated, without a crew, completed 2 orbits around the Earth, and landed flawlessly. And then never again. In 2002, the hull roof collapsed under the snow and buried it. That is hard to beat in terms of irony. The Buran is a metaphor for a program that had everything. The engineers, the technology, the will, and yet it's still lost. It didn't fail because of physics, but because of history. But one thing at a time. My name is Serwan, and this is Mars Chronican. To understand what Russia is in space exploration today, you have to understand what it once was. And that was nothing less than the power that shocked the rest of the world. October 4th, 1957. Sputnik 1 orbits the Earth. A metal sphere, 58 centimeters in diameter, beeping. Panic broke out in the United States. If the Soviets could launch a satellite into orbit, they could launch an atomic bomb at Washington. Congress immediately opened the budget floodgates. NASA was created a year later as a direct response. Wait. The Soviets sent the first human into space. Yuri Gagarin, April 12, 1961. 108 minutes. 1 orbit around the Earth. The world stood still. They sent the first woman into space. Valentina Tereshkova, 1963. They performed the first spacewalk. Alexei Leonov, 1965. 18 minutes out in space, in a spacesuit that had inflated from the vacuum pressure, like a balloon. He had to let out air to crawl back into the spacecraft. Despite all these firsts and victories, they lost the race to the moon. Sergei Korolev, the chief designer, the man who made Sputnik possible, died in 1966 on the operating table during a surgery that would have been survivable under normal circumstances. His death tore apart the Soviet lunar program. The N-1 rocket the Soviet answer to the Saturn V exploded on all 4 test flights. The second attempt, in 1969, produced one of the largest non-nuclear explosions in history. The Soviets never landed anyone on the moon. They even denied for decades that they had ever tried. But what they did while America was flying to the moon was something else. Something that is underestimated in the long history of spaceflight. While America lost interest after Apollo 17, no humans flew beyond low Earth orbit, the Soviets were building space probes. Salyut 1, 1971. Then a series. Salyut 6 held records for long-duration stays. Salyut 7 was brought back to life in one of the most dramatic rescue missions in space history when 2 cosmonauts got a completely failed frozen station working again. Without power, without water, without heating, at minus 12 degrees Celsius on board. Then Mir in 1986. Humanity's first truly permanent space station. Over 15 years in orbit, 104 people from 12 countries visited it. Valery Polyakov stayed for 438 days straight. To this day, that's still the record for a single stay. Mir was the school where humanity learns.
Wie man im Weltraum lebt. Und das über Monate.
The Soviet legacy that's missing from the textbooks. The first lasting step out of our atmosphere. And then came 1991. The Soviet Union collapsed. While that was happening on Earth, a man was floating 400 kilometers above it and no longer had a country to bring him back. Sergei Krikalev launched to the Mir space station on May 18, 1991. Planned mission duration, 5 months. But while he was up there, everything down below was falling apart. The money ran out, the replacement mission was cancelled, the Baikonur Cosmodrome was suddenly on the territory of an independent Kazakhstan, and nobody really knew who was responsible for what anymore. And on December 26, 1991, the Soviet Union officially dissolved. Krigalev found out about it from orbit. I can't imagine what must have been going through his head and gut up there. He stayed. Not because he had to, since there was a Soyuz capsule for emergency evacuation, but because he knew that leaving the station might have endangered its operation. The strongest argument is economic, he said from orbit at the time. The country is in such trouble that they have to save money. He spent a total of 311 days in space, twice as long as planned. He watched from above as his hometown Leningrad became St. Petersburg again. He spoke sporadically with his wife, who worked in mission control, and his 9-month-old child, if they can talk. On March 25, 1992, he landed. But not in the Soviet Union anymore, but in Russia, in a country that hadn't existed as a state before. He is still called the last Soviet citizen to this day. Short break. If this video is already giving you something, hit the hype button if you have it. If not, a like, a subscription, or a comment helps the channel a lot. The algorithm will decide in the next few minutes whether to spread this video further or not. And you help decide. Thank you. And let's continue. With the collapse, the funding also dried up. Engineers who had built rockets were selling potatoes at markets. Rockets disappeared overnight because suppliers were suddenly located in independent states. Parts from Ukraine, engines from Russia, software from Kazakhstan. And now there were borders and currencies between them. The United States did something in the 1990s that is unique in history. They financed the space program of their former enemy. The Nunluga program, the NASA-Russia cooperation agreements, the purchase of engines. All of that was a geopolitical precaution. Better to employ Russian rocket scientists than to have them sell their knowledge. Between 1999 and 2021, Russia received around $1.5 to $2 billion for the export of RD-180 and RD-181 engines to the United States. These engines powered the Atlas V rocket, the rocket that launched the most important satellites into space. America was dependent on Russian rocket engines. That's not propaganda, that's a fact that caused discomfort in Washington for years. And between 2011 and 2020, after the end of the Space Shuttle program until the first manned SpaceX mission, the Soyuz rocket was the only way for American, European, Japanese, and Canadian astronauts to get to the International Space Station. Russia paid a total of almost $3.9 billion for these seats. That's the context that's important. Russia was not just a partner in space exploration. At times, it was an indispensable infrastructure provider. Shortly before the beginning of the major rupture, Russia's space industry was still impressive, but already significantly weakened compared to the Soviet era. The Soyuz rocket, developed in the 1960s, iterated and improved over 6 decades, is the most reliable rocket ever built. Around 2,000 launches, the failure rate is so low that it's barely measurable statistically. The Soyuz spacecraft, which transports the astronauts, is similarly durable, a design from the 1960s that still flies today because it works. On November 27, 2025, something happened that shook all of Russia's manned spaceflight in the short term. A Soyuz rocket was waiting at Launchpad 316 in Baikonur, the only pad used for manned ISS missions, and in the process damaged the so-called service structure. That is, the maintenance structure that gives cosmonauts and technicians access to the capsule before launch. It hadn't moved away quickly enough during the engine blast. Whether it was human error or a technical problem remained unclear at first. But what was clear was this: Russia's only manned launch pad was out of operation. The international spaceflight community held its breath. Experts spoke of possible repair times ranging from months to years. Roscosmos set itself an April 2026 deadline. So 5 months. In the next few days, these strictly limited Starship models will go on sale in our shop. If you want, you can reserve them by email. We used the Prusakor 1 for the production. It's excellent for small batch production, and for those who can wait a little longer, SLS is coming next. Stay tuned. Links to the printer and the model are in the description below, and now back to Russia's space landscape. What followed was impressive in a way, regardless of how you judge the rest of the Russian space program. 18 heavy vehicles rolled into Baikonur with spare parts. Over 130 employees worked in 2 shifts from morning until midnight. Spare parts were gathered from other launch facilities. From the military cosmodrome Plesetsk in the far north, from Russia's own military facilities, from an aerospace plant in the Tambov region. By March 2026, the launch site had already been repaired and was ready for the next Progress cargo mission to the ISS. That showed 2 things at once. First, the Soyuz system is so standardized and has been in operation for so long that spare parts are actually available and compatible. That is a real strength of a decades-old stable design. Second, Russia relies on launch infrastructure without redundancy. A single pad for all manned missions. If it fails, the entire manned program fails with it. The Proton-M was Russia's heavy-lift rocket. For decades, it was the workhorse for geostationary satellites, a proven system, but also one with a series of spectacular failures, including a crash shortly after launch in Baikonur in 2013, which caused a massive explosion and caused significant damage to the cosmodrome. And then there was the Angara, the rocket program that Russia has been developing since the 1990s. A new family of launch vehicles that is supposed to cover everything from light to heavy, without relying on Baikonur in Kazakhstan. A program that began in 1995. 30 years later, the Angara is still in the development phase. A program that takes 3 decades and is still not in serial production has structural problems, regardless of who is responsible for it. And then February 24, 2022. Russia invades, and the global spaceflight architecture, which had functioned in silent cooperation for over 30 years, began to fall apart within weeks. The European Space Agency ESA froze all cooperative activities with Russia. The Soyuz rocket, which had been regularly launching from the European spaceport in Kourou, French Guiana since 2011 and provided Europe with a cost-effective and reliable launch capacity, was withdrawn. The 87 Russian employees at the Launchpad in Kourou were dismissed. OneWeb, a British internet satellite company that had launched its entire constellation on Soyuz rockets, lost its launch capacity overnight. Russia had demanded that the satellites not be used for military purposes. OneWeb refused. The rockets remained on the ground. By 2024, Roscosmos estimated its losses from terminating contracts with what Moscow calls the unfriendly countries at around $2.1 billion, almost 80% of its export revenues in the launch sector. Call it slow decline or structural rupture. So, how have the sanctions affected things specifically? Russia's space industry was dependent on Western components to a degree that even surprised many experts.
Strahlungsresistente Mikrochips.
The US and Europe. Precision sensors, onboard computers, the entire satellite architecture of Russia was based on imported electronics. Because Russia's own semiconductor industry never reached the standard necessary for space-grade components. By mid-2024, according to its own statements, the largest Russian satellite operator had replaced around 60% of the foreign components affected by sanctions with domestic or Western alternatives. That sounds impressive and at the same time shows how big the problem was. But 40% are still unresolved. The solution that Russia has chosen is a radical one. They prioritize quantity over high-quality individual components. The officially stated goal is to increase satellite production by about 15% per year to 200 by 2026 and 400 by 2030. CubeSats in mass production. Short lifespan, rapid deployment, quality replaced by quantity. That's a strategically understandable decision. It's also a decision that shows Russia has given up competing on the technological level. In 2025, Roscosmos carried out 17 orbital launches. All of them were successful. That sounds like a decent number until you consider that SpaceX completed over 160 launches in that time. And China is well over 30. 17. That's the level of the early 1960s. For context, at the height of Soviet spaceflight in the 1980s, Soviet rockets launched more than 100 times per year. The number dropped dramatically after the collapse and never really recovered. The rocket family looks like this today. The Soyuz 2 variants remain the workhorse. Proven reliable limited. Proton M will be phased out and replaced by the Angara. The Angara A5 carried out its first launch from the Vostochny Cosmodrome in the Far East in 2024. Almost 30 years after the program began. And the Angara has already been officially classified as obsolete before it even reached serial production. The Soyuz 5, also known as Irtish or Sunkar, is a new medium-class rocket that is supposed to replace the Russian-Ukrainian Zenit. 2A first test launch is planned for 2026. With mixed success, a static fire test in the fall of 2025 failed. First, there was a serious accident at a Launchpad in Baikonur and problems with the upper stage of the Proton M. 3 failures with 3 different causes, in quick succession. The next question is, are there private actors in this field in Russia? There are some initiatives. Bureau 1440, a private Russian company, is building a LEO constellation for broadband internet in Russia and has already launched several batches of Razvet-3 satellites on Soyuz rockets. Success rockets and Sputniks are other names that come up. But honestly, the comparison with what SpaceX, Rocket Lab, or even Chinese private companies are achieving is not appropriate. The Russian space industry is still fundamentally state-dominated. The ecosystem of venture capital, independent infrastructure, and an iterative development culture that has enabled the Western private industry does not exist in Russia. That is the structural reality of an industrial sector that has been shaped by state control and state budgets for 70 years. For a long time, it was the same in both China and the West. Now we have to talk about a story that is emblematic of everything that has happened in Russian and European spaceflight in recent years. A story that began with great ambitions but was shaped by political events. And now maybe it will finally come to an end. The story of the Rosalind Franklin rover. ExoMars is a European program. The goal, to send a rover to Mars that actively searches for signs of past life. The first Mars rover capable of drilling up to 2 meters deep, where organic molecules could be protected from ultraviolet radiation. The program began originally with NASA as a partner. NASA withdrew in 2012 for budgetary reasons. Roscosmos stepped in. They provided the launch vehicle, the Proton, and the descent module, meaning the lander. The launch was scheduled for 2018, then 2020. Both times, there were problems with the lander's parachute system. Parachutes again and again. It's almost absurd. One of the most complicated Mars rovers in history held up by parachute problems. And then February 2022, the final blow, Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The ESA stopped all cooperative activities with Russia, as we've already mentioned. The descent module, fully qualified, prepared and ready to go, remained in Russia. The rover, also finished, also qualified, was sitting in Europe and had no way to get to Mars anymore. An ESA insider described the ExoMars project at the time as snakebit. Cursed, first no NASA partner, then technical problems, then a war. But now there is actually a new development. The ESA is working on a new lander developed by European and British partners. And at the end of 2025, NASA is signaling a possible involvement despite all budget uncertainties. The earliest realistic launch date is 2028. It's still uncertain if that will work. One thing is certain though. A fully completed, fully qualified Mars rover named after the scientist Rosalind Franklin, whose groundbreaking X-ray images made the discovery of the DNA double helix possible and who never received the Nobel Prize for it. because she had already passed away. It has been sitting in storage for years. Done. Waiting, an absolute geopolitical catastrophe. Perhaps the most tragic single moment in recent Russian space history occurred on August 20, 2023. Luna 25. It was the first Russian lunar mission since Luna 24 in 1976. 47 years. Russia aimed to be the first nation to land in the southwestern part of the moon's south polar region. Exactly the area where water ice is suspected, the most strategically important terrain in the inner solar system. The mission launched on August 11, 2023. Everything went nominal at first. And then, during the braking maneuver for the transition into a lower orbit, there was a problem with the engine. The braking took too long. Luna 25 hit the lunar surface at the wrong speed. Collision, no landing, the end. 4 days later, on August 23, India's Chandrayaan-3 successfully landed in the South Polar region, exactly where Russia had wanted to land. The timing could hardly have been more symbolically devastating. India, a country that built its first space program in the 1960s with Soviet help, achieved the goal that Russia had missed. And Chandrayaan-3 had something that Luna 25 didn't. And Chandrayaan-3 had something that Luna 25 didn't. A rover. The ability to move, to explore, and to investigate more than just a single landing site. What Luna 25 represents is a bitter irony. The Soviet program that originally developed the lunar missions carried out a total of 19 successful lunar missions in the 1960s and 1970s. Among them were the first soft landings, the first lunar rovers, and the first automatic retrievals from the moon. That was back then. In 2023, the first new mission after almost 50 years of hiatus failed immediately. Now let's talk about the relationship between Russia and its former and current partners. And here we have to distinguish between the West and China. The ISS is the last remaining symbol of cooperation with the West. And it's a symbol that is slowly but surely coming to an end. The station is scheduled to be deorbited in the early 2030s. NASA and its Western partners plan to continue until then. Russia has never formally agreed to extend the mission until 2030, but continues to cooperate operationally. There's a simple reason for that. Russia still needs the ISS because it has no alternative. The planned Russian Orbital Service Station, or ROS for short, still exists mainly only on paper. The first module, the Science and Energy module, which was originally supposed to launch in 2024, has been postponed to 2028 at the earliest. And even that is not guaranteed to be funded. So Russia is in a structurally uncomfortable position. It cooperates with countries that have sanctioned it because it needs the infrastructure that only exists through this cooperation. The RD-180 engine program, which powered the American Atlas V for years and brought billions into Russian coffers, has now ended. The US has been using American engines for years now. The last connection that made Russia an indispensable partner in the American space program has been cut. Russia and China, that's the interesting story. And here, you have to be especially clear-eyed because both sides use the relationship for their own narrative. Just like the West and everyone else, by the way. China and Russia signed an agreement in 2021 to jointly develop the International Lunar Research Station, the ILRS. Russia and China's alternative to the Artemis Accords. On paper, this is an equal partnership between two space powers. In practice, it looks different. China is the dominant partner. They invest significantly more, have significantly greater independent capabilities, and increasingly determine the pace and direction of the program. Russia brings in its technological legacy, especially in the field of compact nuclear reactors for lunar energy policy, an area where Russian expertise is actually relevant. And in return, it gets the opportunity to be present on the moon as part of the larger project. A Chinese strategist put it this way in an analysis. Sanctions had cut Roscosmos off from many imports. But Chinese institutions can ease the pressure. That's plain language, diplomatically phrased. China has the negotiating power. Russia needs China more than the other way around. The image of the ILRS as an equal Chinese-Russian initiative does not correspond to operational reality. It's a Chinese initiative with Russian participation, if we're being honest. That's not meant as a judgment, it's simply a description of the balance of influence. Just like Artemis is a US effort with European participation. What are Russia's actual strengths? If we're being honest in our assessment, 1. The Soyuz system. I say this with genuine respect. The Soyuz capsule is a masterpiece of iterative engineering. 60 years of development have produced a system that is more robust and reliable than almost anything built since. The life support and rescue system and the landing sequence, all thoroughly tested. If there were a space crisis tomorrow and you had to reliably send a person into space and bring them back, Soyuz would still be a top choice. Second, engine technology. The RD-180 wasn't in such high demand for nothing. The Russian school of liquid rocket engines has decades of experience with high-pressure chambers, regenerative cooling, and turbopump design. This expertise can't be replaced overnight. The RD-191, which powers the Angara, is a direct descendant of this tradition. Drittens, space medicine and long-duration missions. Nowhere else in the world is there more accumulated knowledge about what happens to the human body during long stays in space than in Russia. The experience from Mir, from the ISS, from the record-breaking stays, is a body of knowledge that cannot simply be replicated. Now let's discuss their weaknesses. We've already briefly mentioned the electronics. That's the fundamental problem. That's what Russia has. They never built a competitive semiconductor industry. And without their own radiation-resistant chips, an independent satellite constellation in the military sense is not possible in the long term. The management. The corruption problems in the Russian space industry are documented and absolutely real. Between 2011 and 2014, over $100 million intended for the Vostochny Cosmodrome were embezzled. The former Roscosmos chief, Dmitry Rogozhin, known for theatrical Twitter tirades rather than operational management, was replaced in 2022 by Yuri Borisov, who was unexpectedly succeeded by Dmitry Bakanov in February 2025. 3 chiefs in just a few years. That doesn't create industrial continuity. And last but not least, the cadence. 17 launches in 2025. China launches more than 5 times as many launches in a single year. SpaceX alone launches more per quarter than Russia does in an entire year. No launches, no experience, no improvement, and the geopolitical situation makes it very difficult for a commercial market to develop there at all. Now, to the question I want to answer most honestly, is Russia still a space power? The short answer is yes. But with a very important caveat. Russia is a space power in the sense that it has launch vehicles that work reliably. It has cosmonauts who regularly fly to the ISS. It has satellites in orbit. Among them is the GLONASS navigation system, military early warning systems and communication satellites. It has engineers with deep institutional knowledge. Russia is no longer a space power in the sense that it can help determine the global course of space exploration. It can carry out missions that push scientific progress to the forefront. It can act as a preferred partner for ambitious international programs. The withdrawal from the commercial market is complete. The share of global launch capacity is marginal. The scientific missions, with the exception of participation in the ISS, are more ambitious on paper than in reality. A Russian space analyst, Pavel Lutzin, put it this way: Russia will continue to send its cosmonauts into orbit with Soyuz capsules. But the main purpose will be to show the flag, without any significant scientific results. That's a harsh assessment, but it matches the available facts. What's next? Luna 26 is planned as a lunar orbiter. Explore sites for Luna 27 and later serve as a communications relay. No launch date is officially confirmed at the moment. Luna 27 is supposed to be a heavy lander that will explore the lunar South Pole, planned for the late 2020s. But after the Luna 25 failure in 2023, there is now increased pressure to fundamentally revise the technology. Ross, the Russian orbital service station, remains the most ambitious goal. And at the same time, it's the hardest to believe. The first module is realistically possible in 2028 at the earliest. The entire station is expected to be operational in the 2030s. Considering everything we know about delays in Russian spaceflight, that's a very optimistic estimate. Soyuz 5 is scheduled to launch for the first time in 2026 and will fill the Zenit gap. But the commercial viability is questionable. Western customers are shut out, and Chinese rockets are more price competitive. I'd like to close with a thought that hasn't left me throughout all this research. Russia brought humanity into space. That's not flattery and not a political statement. That's a historical fact. Gagarin, Tereshkova, Leonov, Mir, the foundations of space medicine. The first permanent presence in orbit. That is a legacy. Independent of everything that happened afterwards, is real and significant. And at the same time, this legacy today hangs like a huge shadow over a program that struggles to step out from under it. The Soyuz design is 60 years old. The Angara has been a work in progress for 30 years. Ross is a vision without secure funding. The Luna 25 mission has crashed. What is missing is not talent. Russian engineers are still good. What is missing is the combination of institutional health, sufficient funding, geopolitical integration, and the courage for real innovation. So not just iteration of the eternally familiar, but the risk of something new. The sanctions did not cause the decline. They accelerated and deepened it. The structural decline began with the collapse of the Soviet Union. And has continued through 30 years of insufficient investment, corruption, and the failure to build an independent electronics and semiconductor industry. The Buran is no longer in Baikonur. It lies under the roof that collapsed in 2002. A spacecraft that flew once. Flawless, automated, without a crew. And then never again. That's the story of Russian spaceflight. In one picture. My name is Sirwan, and that was Mars Chronican. Thank you for tuning in. Perasperadastra. The Russian School of Liquid Rocket Engines. The Russian School of Liquid Rocket Engines. The Russian School of Liquid Rocket Engines has decades of experience with high-pressure chambers, regenerative cooling, and turbopump design. To the slate. That was take 3. All right, focus.